Bill and Isobel, thank you again for coming in. We really look forward to having these chats with you. So this time, yeah, we wanted to find out, just what your thoughts are on all the shenanigans. That might not be the right word, but shenanigans
I think
going
it
on
is.
about Greenland so recently, and it sort of strikes me there's two things. There's about that. There's Arctic security, and I mean, to a certain extent, I look at the maps, and because it's all white at the top, I sort of think, well, there's not really a danger. It's all covered in ice, except, of course, it's less covered in ice than it was. Plus, submarines can get underneath that ice, and I'm sure they go backwards and forwards all the time. And then there's the kind of Iceland, Greenland, Faroes, UK gap, that
Mm-hmm.
sort of set of bits of the Northern Atlantic. And then maybe another thing to get into is what's Trump up to? I mean, does he really want Greenland? Because there's not
Yeah.
much of a defence argument for getting it. There's not even much of an economic one.
Let's consider some basic things about Scotland's position in the world. They say it's on the front line. Well, let's look at the front line. We all know that every so often a big lumbering Russian bomber comes down to somewhere off the coast of Scotland, out of Scottish territorial waters, or in British airspace for that matter, and two typhoons or whatever are sent up. One wiggles its wing and gets photographed by the other in front of that. The story of that bomber is interesting. First of all, and this is about Scotland being on the front line, it leaves somewhere, up in one of the Russian air bases. First of all, it encounters the Finnish armed forces and whatever assets the world's hegemonic navy has in that area. Secondly, it encounters the Swedish armed forces and whatever assets the world's hegemonic navy has in that area. Thirdly, it encounters Norwegian armed forces and whatever the US Navy has in that area. And fourthly, it gets to the North Sea. So the idea that Scotland is in the front line is rather overblown, and is often used as a part of some sort of argument that the Russians are coming, and we can come back to that one as well. But literally, you've got Finland, Sweden, Norway, and then Scotland. So the idea that Scotland is in a dangerous and uncertain part of the world, slightly less so than other places, and we know that. Why? Because take the ferry over the Irish Sea, and where do you come to? You come to a wee island. So the question is, you've got Scotland, which is in a dangerous, uncertain world, and an island, which is in a geopolitical sleepy hollow. There are other issues, but that's a basic point that should be borne in mind. In a geopolitical sense, and we don't talk about it very much, the key relationship is with our neighbour, England. That's always been Scotland's key geopolitical determinant. I remember some time ago looking for some books on Scottish foreign policy before the Union of the Crowns, or the Act of Union. And actually, there are some, but not that many. Why? Because virtually every book in Scottish history before the two unions, the dominant narrative in it is a relationship with our nearest neighbour. And of course, that's the issue. England skewing off towards the United States, or is England looking towards Europe? And in that regard, one of the recent things with Starmer is a real subservience to the United States.
I mean, I think the word of the month is rupture. And in many ways, this is a good time to think of independence in Scotland, because the whole of Europe is having to rethink what their position is. So a time for fresh thinking, a time for thinking what is in Scotland's interests, and also a time for questioning all the lazy assumptions that we've been fed for so long, which is all about we have a big enemy who is about to attack. Now, I would accept that if you're an immediate neighbour of Russia, and particularly if you were part of the previous Soviet Union. So yes, you're in the Baltic states. I can understand that feeling, and obviously from the Ukraine experience, most certainly so. But the Ukraine experience is one that should be questioning this whole issue of the huge, dangerous Russia, because nearly 4 years, and they've managed at huge cost to gain a modest amount of land in what is an immediate neighbour with large minorities who are ethnic Russian. And this is not an indication of huge Russian threats or strength, but it is an indication of Russian weakness in many ways. But the big issue now is that all the lazy assumptions, we're part of Atlanticism, we're part of the whole US protection, that has gone.
Yeah.
And even if you have changes of president, etc., people now know that there is always going to be a big question mark over that. I mean, in my lifetime, which is longer than any of yours, the United States has always been involved in overseas wars. It's always been an imperial power. Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then on to all the Middle Eastern wars and so on. And that's not including the terrible black ops that the whole of Latin America experienced. So the notion that this is some benign ally that we could always rely on was never true, but it most certainly has ended now, which means we've got to rethink. And the start of that rethinking should be, I think, twofold. One, for an independent Scotland, how do you best protect our borders? And we should be expecting that every country would be asking that question. And that is a protection question. It's not how do we attack someone in the Middle East, or how do we attack someone hundreds of miles away. So there's a protection question, but then there is the wider, who will be our European allies if we want to be into alliance? What shape will that take?
Yeah. Small states, and when it comes to military terms, they may be under threat, they may not be under threat. As long as Scotland is not perceived as a threat by England, then Scotland is highly unlikely to be invaded by anyone. It's simply incredible in that sense. And provided our relationship with England is positive, then that's not going to, it's simply not going to happen. I mean, after all, if you actually look at why we have a British state, it's because Scotland was seen as a national security threat to England. I mean, early on in the medieval period, they were expanding and expanding, but leaving that aside, Scotland was seen as the back door into England from, the Valois in France, or the Habsburgs in Spain. That finished a long time ago, but it was seen as a security threat. That door had to be shut. Ireland was seen as a security threat. That door had to be shut. Well, there are no continental powers wishing to invade England, so that is past history. And there's sometimes conflation around these sort of issues. The great powers are held up as as potential threats, and in some ways you could argue that they could influence in various ways. I mean, for instance, they're talking about China. If China wanted to lean on Scotland, before they twitch the dragon's tail, they would say the following: we want you to change your semester system in the Scottish universities. And see, if you don't, we're going to take our girls away. And the threat of that to the economic model of Scottish universities, that would be pressure. They wouldn't be asking to take over Faz Lane. So there's that. The United States influence would be different. And the Russian influence is, again, different again. The last chief of the defence staff, a year and a bit ago, when Keir Starmer started to talk about the military Keynesianism, the idea we need to beef up our armed forces, he did say during that day, and it was picked up by one or two journalists, it should be noted that Russia, the Russian Federation, is making heavy weather of their war, of the war in Ukraine. And that's effectively a sort of toned down version of what Isobel was just saying.
Yeah.
I have seen in discussion over the last week or so, the threat being from Trump's America to Scotland on the grounds that look what his intentions are towards Greenland, which already has a US base on it. What's to stop him coming a little bit further round and, taking Scotland, because we've also got a base there. This concept that that's our ally, as Isobel's just said, is sort of out the water now. But what we're not sure of is how far do his intentions go. Yes. We've had Starmer admitting for the first time, I think, that the nuclear deterrent is a US deterrent.
Yes.
So any thoughts on that?
This is a huge dilemma for England or the rest of the UK if Scotland became independent, because the UK still has this fantasy positioning of itself as a world power. And its position as that actually depends militarily on the US. So it has this almost complete dependence on the US militarily in so many respects, and completely in terms of its so-called nuclear capacity. So the rupture is a huge dilemma for England, but it wouldn't be for an independent Scotland, because the Faslane base is English, or would be English. It's not Scottish. And only recently have the Americans, I think, come back again to Lossiemouth, so there is that. But apart from that, and honestly, in terms of the US's technological capacity, these don't particularly matter. I mean, the distance and the power and the speed of the new technologies for, the major powers like the US mean that some of the specific geographies don't have the significance they had. And they certainly don't have as far as the US and Scotland's concerned.
Can I pick up on a couple of things? One was just how you mentioned what you said there about possible way that, say, China might try and influence Scotland, not with a big aircraft carrier off the coast, but doing that kind of thing. Just going back to Greenland, I was reading that 90% of the Greenland economy is from fishing. Mm-hmm. And half of that fish is exported to China. So that already gives them a kind of an economic, a similar kind of economic in, if you like. If they wanted to make something of it, they could. Although I'm sure the Greenlanders could sell their fish somewhere else. But I mean, if they are selling it to China, that's quite that's a long way to take your fish. So there's that, and then the other thing is, yes. Okay, so maybe it's always been our relationship with England that's kind of had been first and foremost. But if we think about us being independent, probably going back fairly quickly into the EU, at any rate being very much aligned with the EU. I mean, the EU themselves have been putting a lot of money into security for that North Atlantic bit of ocean, haven't they? I mean, apparently Denmark itself just last year was spending something like 13 billion euros. So obviously that group of countries with which we want to align does think that it's worthwhile and there's a need.
That can be overblown somewhat. Within the NATO situation, and I slightly disagree with Isobel here. NATO's got so many members of so many different positions that the idea that it takes unified positions is pretty much laughable. There was a Ramsay seminar last week, in fact, and what they were looking at was the intra-NATO problem of the United States leaning on another NATO member. Well, that's not new. Not the United States, but since NATO was set up, Greece and Turkey see each other as their two main military potential competitors. The reason that for 30 odd years, Greece has spent more in arms than other European comparable countries is because of the possible threat of another fight, a military action between Greece and Turkey. So the idea of intra-NATO tensions is not new. It was Turkey that hosted the first or the early peace talks that took place in 2022, or attempted peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, because it was seen by the Russians as a somewhat honest broker, although it was a NATO member. So it's much, much more complicated than that. And I think the thing about Greenland is actually, in many ways, is actually Canada. And Mark Carney's speech at the Davos conference is well worth a listen to, because it's
wonderful.
Back to the point about basic geopolitics. There's no such thing as a constant friend and ally. He summed it up in his basic points. In Canada, he went to China. They've made trade relationships with China. Soon there'll be Chinese SUVs on sale in Canada that will be much cheaper than the American ones and have a higher quality, apparently. And Americans will cross the border and they will buy these SUVs. So the Canadians are taking a somewhat different point of view. And they even let it out that the staff officers were doing contingency planning in case the Americans invaded and vice versa. But that's been going on for years.
Yeah.
Eisenhower when he was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army in the 30s, and MacArthur and George Marshall, who was the chair of the Joint Chiefs, their boss during the war, all went to the staff college. And part of their training was, how do they would plan an invasion of Canada in other ways round. The Danes are actually in many ways quite interesting, because at that Ramsay seminar, they mentioned the fact about the Turkey-Greece thing. I brought it up. They mentioned it, that I brought it up. But there's another point. The fact that Turkey and Greece are allowed, inverted commas, within the NATO architecture to sort of have a level of tension, is that formally recognised within the diplomatic architecture of NATO? Because if it is, Denmark agreed to that. And now Denmark at the foot, it's on the other foot. And the other, this is a long-term thing in a letter or somewhere in the National about this. Global warming is causing, of course, new sea lanes to open up, particularly in the Chinese context. Yeah, it's round about northern Russia, but it's really economical. It's the Chinese. So you've got that. 2020, in the run-up to COP, when I was still senior office bearer of the IS, I was doing some prep work for the educational aspects of COP26, and I was listening to a lot of seminars. And I listened to a very revealing seminar by some American climatologists, and they were saying that the southern states of the United States are going to become less habitable as time goes on. And there's going to be a population shift from the southern states into the northern states. And at some point, the United States is going to go to Canada and say, do you want to become the 51st state? That's 30 years in the future. And that's coming unless we deal with climate change. But of course, that's 20, 30 years in the future.
Yeah, it is. And there's actually, let's face it, though, there's a lot of space left in Minnesota and the Dakotas and, Oregon and Washington. Not to make light of that, but that's a global thing. There's going to be masses of countries around the equator, even, including Indian subcontinent, that are going to be not habitable.
And
that's not just a bit of an American ship possible.
perhaps the good news in that is maybe Mar-a-Lago will become unlivable in. But we have to ask, why do states initiate wars or aggressive activity? And it's either because they feel they're under threat or because other places have things that they want. Now, you ask about why did he want Greenland? Well, there were some future things. No, he doesn't need it for military purposes, but there were some future economic things, but also because it, as someone says, he's a real estate person, and it looks a big enlargement of territory and power. But when you come to look at Scotland, in some ways, I mean, there were two things you could say, but here it's really only the English state, if we were independent, would be very, very anxious about its Faslane base, but it's now being exposed that this is all dependent on the US, and the more we can expose, both to people in Scotland, but more particularly to people in England, that this is an extremely expensive fantasy, big power fantasy. And it is nothing to do, it's to do with prestige, it's nothing to do with defence. So that is important. But apart from that, it may be actually fortunate that we're moving into a position in which Scotland's oil reserves have diminished. And therefore, that is not a particularly attractive option for anyone to say, oh, we want to take over the oil reserves. And moving over to renewables, fortunately, renewables aren't quite the kind of thing you can capture in the same way. So that if we didn't have a nuclear base or any other major base designed for more distant warfare, if we didn't have that, so we're not a threat, and we don't have the simple resource thing that might be a temptation to go for capture, then why would they want to? And when we come to China, I mean, we should remember that Bill will probably know America has overseas military bases.
I think it's not 800.
That is a huge number of overseas military bases. China has a tiny number. That's not the route through which China has gone. It has pursued, and it has been successful in terms of its creating economic relationships, and to some extent economic dependency. And that has been its approach. Now, obviously, if you're in Taiwan, yes, there's a threat and a risk, but it hasn't been looking at engaging at big overseas wars. I always find it so ridiculous, all the talk about Chinese spying and how Britain's got to protect them. And I'm at a loss to know what it is that the Chinese, what information are they seeking that's of any value to them? Because they're way ahead of us in almost everything in the kind of technological sphere. So this is just blown up to justify a very bloated security services.
What you were saying about, the way the Chinese governments over the years have chosen to influence people, has been more subtle. And I mean, they've created economic dependency in various countries around the world, particularly in Africa. So there's that. But if we can go back, could we go back to Mark Carney's speech? Because, like you picked up on the word rupture, Isobel. That was, one of his kind of like shockwave sentences quite early on, wasn't it? Sort of saying, this is rupture. This is not about gradual change. It's about rupture. But in that speech, he also talked about like middle-sized countries coming together and exploring how to, cooperate, work together on the basis of shared values as far as you could. And he's very pragmatic, isn't he? He said, well, that's not completely 100% possible, but where there's an overlap, then let's make, in terms of values, let's make the most of that. But
I think he was actually brutal and more harder. He says, about the strong, the weak must do what they must.
Well, he was saying that is what's happening at the moment, but then laying out a different way.
I think if you were to go back to his speech, he stripped it down to basic geopolitical determinants and he took in my view, and maybe we can disagree, I think folks should look at it again. Yeah, he took what we call the realist approach to international relations. And in some sense, that's one of the reasons, as I would say, a member of the SNP, a socialist, an anti-nuclear campaigner, but I see myself as in the realist school. Some people don't like that because, to me, ethical foreign policies have a place, but they're limited. And we are going to get on with, or not fall out with, or certainly not go to war with, regimes that are quite brutal. I mean, I can name some countries in the Middle East that are not nice places, and we have no intentions or the bigger countries have no intentions putting sanctions on them. It's for other reasons. And again, there's a basic point I think that's very important about the United States and about Britain at the moment. I mean, we talked about the military-industrial complex, but the United States, the military-industrial complex drives a lot of American foreign policy. They invent a tool, and then they find some sort of way, a stick or a hammer, and they then rationalise it after inventing the hammer and making the money. The Chinese do it the other way around. The Communist Party of China are in charge of their military-industrial complex. They do the strategy, and the military-industrial complex comes up with, as they see it, whatever's necessary. That's why China's got 3 aircraft carriers and American have got 12. I mean, and for other reasons as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that is very important. And I'd say Carney's speech was really quite different. I mean, one can turn around to him and say about values and all that. But frankly, it's not about, in my view, and you can disagree, it's not about values. It's about basic geopolitical interests. Because there are countries where Britain, and I don't disagree with this point, have cordial relationships with countries that are not nice places.
I don't think you and I are actually saying much different, because I heard him, he definitely heard him, make that statement about, it's going back to a kind of big three nations, although why he includes Russia these days is one of the big three. But anyway, China, Russia, a state, and Russia and America, and exerting their power to get what they want. And he's, he was acknowledging that and saying, well, middle-sized countries, what are we going to do? And when I said working on shared values, I didn't mean that he was implying that would be any kind of, namby-pamby kind of approach. It wasn't. It was just saying we do have shared values. They are different from what Trump's describing and acting on at the moment. So let's not forget that and go with it as far as we can. But of course, it doesn't. Of course, you're going to end up with relationships, trade relationships, security relationships, even with countries that you wouldn't want to live in them yourselves.
It would give Scotland, an independent Scotland, the opportunity to make choices in the light of what we have a few years from now, because we're in a situation that we don't know what's going to happen with NATO as we know it. We don't know what's going to happen with the kind of governments that might emerge in Germany, in France, certainly in those that have emerged in Hungary, etc.
In England, if Farage gets
or in England, yes. So we have to be in a position where we say, where I wouldn't entirely agree with what Bill was saying. We have to be in a position where we do know what our values are. We do state what our values are, but we do accept that sometimes even coming from that position of strong values and stated values, that you do have to make some compromises in terms of who you relate to, who you're involved with. Yeah. Although I must say this morning I was very uncomfortable in reading that we have a government minister just going over today to the Emirates. This is for trade reasons with Scotland. When I say a government minister, I mean a Scottish government minister. Whereas I feel it's appalling that the Emirates have got away. They have been among the key players in the most atrocious things that have been done in Sudan. and they have been financing because they want to take over areas of land.
Are they not also on this Trump's appalling board of peace, which has got all the rogues that he can round up? I mean, I'm just waiting to see if Starmer puts himself forward, because he certainly hasn't criticised him in any way.
Yes.
Yeah, but Trump, I mean, the board of peace thing is a tragic and farcical at the same time. And again, we're seeing the limits of, if you can call it, ethical foreign policies when it comes to the relationship with the Israeli state. Trump himself, right? Trying to get one's head around Trump is difficult. And again, I found myself in a conceptual comfort zone when I started to think of him as some sort of pre-modern monarch with court factions. And one court faction is in the up in one day and one court faction is in the up the other day. You know, you get the invasion of Venezuela. Well, you don't actually, of course. You get the abduction of the president of Venezuela and very little else. It's as if Marco Rubio on one day had the president's ear, they did a special operation and they excised, kidnapped effectively, the president of Venezuela. And then the next day, it was seen as going too far. And the vice president of Venezuela is now seen as acceptable. I mean, there's a bizarreness about it, and it seems to fluctuate between different factions in his court.
I heard him described as the mistake is thinking that it's about politics. He's actually a showman. He's a TV host, and everything that he does is all about managing the publicity of his show. And that's why you get something that was appallingly beyond the pale 2 weeks ago. You've forgotten all about it because of what happened last week, which we'll forget about because of what happens this week. Yeah. And all he cares about is the ratings for his show. Is it dominating the airwaves and the media, which it is, which is horrific, really. He's
an extraordinarily, not a stupid man, far from it, but an ignorant man. His thing over the sacrifices, or whatever way you want to put it, of personnel, NATO personnel in Afghanistan. I mean, what he was actually talking, I mean, the man is so ignorant he didn't actually quite understand what he was talking about. He was talking about, originally I think there was about 9 countries that had provisos when the ISAF operation was set up in Afghanistan, right? And some were prepared to go into the front line from the very beginning, but others not so much to start with. The Germans, the French and others, although the Germans and the French, they expanded their operations a bit more, but other countries said with provisos. And so there are a number of NATO members that weren't in the front line, and they made that clear from the beginning, right? I think that's what he had in his head when he made those very offensive remarks. I mean, they were offensive and they were cruel and they were outrageous for someone in that position. And then he seems to have backed down a bit, and even Starmer was forced into rebuking him. And again, that shows this man who is not stupid, who's extraordinarily powerful, who vacillates from one thing to another. It means that people have to, as I was saying with the rupture, people have to get back to thinking about what international relations is about. Yeah. Because as Isobel was saying and others have said, a lot of European politicians have been very lazy. They've used words like the rules-based order, although many years ago I realised that when centrist politicians were talking about the rules-based order, what they meant was anything other than the UN. You know, because if you're talking about the rules-based order, there is the United Nations. But politicians of dubious stripe, geopolitically from our point of view, use the term rules-based order when they mean something other than the United Nations. And now Carney is forcing people to wake up and start thinking about basic international relations.
Can I say the current situation is much, much bigger problem for an independent England, or hopefully just rest of the UK, but hopefully Wales and Ireland might have changed by then as well. It's a much, much bigger problem for them. It's not in a way such a big problem for Scotland or an independent Scotland, because the relationship with the US is very important to England as the political class in England sees itself. It wouldn't be, it has some trading importance for Scotland, but not a security importance in that kind of sense. And we should remember, if we go back to when the initial deal was made, we're going back here to the late 50s, the early 60s, when we had Harold Macmillan having to go cap in hand, first to Eisenhower, and then it was Kennedy, begging for a delivery system for their bomb, because the delivery system that they had worked on, Blue Streak, etc., had failed. So they went pleading, but the interesting thing in terms of the documentation, the historical documentation that is there, the US military did not want to give them that. They were hostile to giving them a US delivery system. But politically, it was decided that they would, on condition they got the Holy Loch, because at that point they were looking for a European base, submarine base, which they don't need anymore. So one mustn't assume that the US would be offended if Scotland said, no, remove your nuclear weapons, remove Trident.
Oh,
because it's not something the US either needs or perhaps it particularly wants. This is an English problem, basically, an English state problem.
Interesting.
There was an article in the Telegraph, and it was a former naval officer of admiral rank. I could be wrong, but I think he actually ran or supervised the MOD's nuclear program. And he said that the United Kingdom is not fit is in no position to run a nuclear submarine weapons program. Two things are really interesting about it. The fact they said it, three things. Second thing was it reported in the Telegraph, and the third thing, as far as I'm aware, it was hardly covered anywhere else in the media. The day after Chancellor Merz won the election to become a Chancellor, he had a month to go before he took office. He came out with a statement saying that Europe should maybe consider the French and the British providing a separate nuclear umbrella for Europe. The next day or two, President Macron pointed out that only France has got an independent nuclear program. Britain doesn't have it. And again, the coverage in the British media of that was not great. And that's an aspect, it's a sub-aspect of the current hiatus and rupture. Macron is looking at it a bit different. And if you look at it from Macron's point of view, he thinks there's an opportunity. He's got the Front National, or its successor organisation, Le Pen's organisation, although she's not allowed to stand at the moment, breathing down his neck electorally. And he's trying to create a sort of Gaulish legacy. I mean, people forget in 1971, when President Nixon decided to reorder the economic system and the way the dollar is worked, we don't have time to look at it. De Gaulle, next day, said, we want our gold back, like that. And the French have always had a genuinely, I don't believe in nuclear weapons for, I don't agree with them, but theirs was and is independent. Britain's is not. So Merz had to change his tune in that one in relation to that. And that creates problems for Europe as well. For Macron, well, that's great. The Americans go, and everybody else in Europe can come under the French umbrella. The French umbrella is not actually. It's very much based in France. And the French, from time to time, their attitude to nuclear planning within NATO is decidedly iffy. So that throws another spanner in the works.
Yeah, and I mean, France, of course, has got lots of nuclear power. So that means, when it pumps the fuel for the
Yeah.
for the weapons, actually they can make their own.
But this perhaps gives Scotland, assuming an independent Scotland, a real point of opportunity for looking at the kind of defence we need, because there are areas of our security which are extremely vulnerable. I mean, if I was wanting to attack us, I wouldn't be bothered with a lot of the conventional military stuff. I would go, and we are very vulnerable to attacking the undersea cables and supplies. I mean, that's the first thing. When you look at the map of the undersea cables on which we are overwhelmingly dependent for almost everything now, and the ease with which they can be damaged, just not by hostile action, but by accident and so on. But you would go for that. The other thing, there are other kinds of security which are really quite important, like organised crime, where Scotland is vulnerable because of its coastline. And in fact, there is a UK figure, I think, that was used in one of its security reports about the billions that are lost to the exchequer because of organised crime and its imports, illegal imports. And some of that, of course, is coming from the south, but Scotland's borders are simply not policed.
I think you're right with that, about different kinds of threat. So the subsea cables are a big one, although again, countries like round in the Baltic and us across to Norway, people begin to think about that. They're putting they're at least putting orders for small warships in to kind of keep an eye on it. But I mean, that's a big threat. So is hacking. Of which the Russians are very good. And
the sector leaders on that are actually, I mean, I'm not saying the Russians, of course, do it, but actually in terms of disruption, securities disruptions are more likely to happen. And when they will happen, they're not going to say it. The state is not going to turn around and say that was the Russians that hacked that. They'll maybe speculate. But that actually is very important. I mean, one thing that Scotland could do if it was independent, and it would take I'm not saying we use the Chinese technology, they could or whatever, you could seed the seabed with sensors. Scotland could do the same within its own territorial waters. It could then turn round and open source it. In other words, Scotland has sensor systems operating within its territorial waters. But like people tracking aircraft, it would be open source. And we could even put it under the control of the United Nations. That would, in effect, partly demilitarise the areas within Scottish territorial waters. If a Russian submarine came into that area, folk would see it. And if suddenly it went blank, then folk would know that somebody had got at the sensors. I actually made that comment in a piece that the National did a couple of weeks ago, but a security expert came back and said, no, the Americans wouldn't tolerate that. In other words, I was saying the Americans wouldn't allow Scotland to have the sensors under our, in our sea. I don't agree with it.
What could they do?
How could they stop it?
Well, I mean, it's just a statement from someone who has a point of view and maybe has an interest. Because I'm not talking about the individual themselves, but one of the things about a lot of the security, not all of them, but a lot of the security experts is, particularly the academy, particularly academia, particularly think tanks, is not all of them, who funds the projects and why. And this comes back to the military-industrial complex. And this is a personal view. One of the reasons why we've had this military Keynesianism is because of a panic among the arms manufacturers. More in Germany than here. If you are an arms manufacturer, say like Rheinmetall in Germany, you produce tanks and stuff like that, your products have a limited use. And likewise, if a company doesn't configure to do drones, underwater drones, to sensor, with sensors and so on tied in, if their products don't fit the new defence challenges or security challenges that Isobel was pointing out, that's a danger for them, because that means loss of revenue. It means either they lose the revenue, or they've got to completely reconfigure into other sorts of products, because the products that the military, fast jets there's no point in having them in Scotland. I mean, a good example of that is actually New Zealand. They got rid of their fast jets a few years ago, and they have maritime aircraft. Why? Because if the fast jets would only be used in an air war situation. And basically, if someone was coming with aircraft carriers, it would either be the Americans or the Chinese, and there's not any point fighting them. So there is issues about the weapons that are developed now and their utility in terms of, say, cyber disruption and so on.
Yes, I mean, maybe that's a whole other chat we should have at some point about who do we give big contracts to look after big data, and there's already the NHS in England using Palantir.
Exactly.
I mean, NHS in Scotland has not done anything like that. But so Palantir, I mean, that brings up the whole thing about the ethics of what Palantir might be doing, because apparently they're liaising with ICE over in the States at the moment to help them get data.
And they've got connections with the IDF.
Yes, yes, that's right. And so there's that. Yeah, and maybe we just kind of have to have another chat about that.
Just was going to throw in one sort of final question about, we've mentioned Carney's speech a few times, and it was barnstorming stuff. Very good. Could you imagine Starmer or any other politician on these shores giving that kind of speech?
Yes. The first thing I thought when I only read Carney's speech, but the first thing I thought when I read it was, I think he has actually written this himself.
Well,
yes, he did. He did write it himself.
Yeah.
You kind of know with most of the other politicians that we have, partly because, yes, there's time pressures and so on, but they don't have the intellect.
Yes, exactly.
And they have all their various assistants and spads, etc., writing their speeches and their statements. And it's so seldom you actually hear something and you think there is an intellectual grounding there, and that he's written this himself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And perhaps one of the reasons is that he wasn't a politician. This was in some ways an accidental career. And the point has been made about so much of the leadership in China that they're nearly all engineers and scientists and others, whereas you look at the background in the US and the UK, I don't quite know what the European picture is, but someone had a look at it. And there's very few whose backgrounds wasn't law or wasn't some very general political science degree. And there's hardly anyone with serious backgrounds in other kind of substantial intellectual areas.
Yeah. Talking about Carney writing, because that's been in the news, he did write it himself. I saw a post that Trump had put on his own Truth Social thing, and I read it and I thought, actually, did he even write that? Because that is it's whole sentences. It's got proper clauses and a subject and an object, and I think he doesn't speak like that. I mean, he just rattles on. And actually, my current theory is he doesn't even write his own Truth Socials, actually, at all. But
there's my best friend actually who did it in PhD in industrial relations when we were at uni. About a year ago in the pub says, Michels' iron law of oligarchy. And I says, what the hell are you talking about, Alan? And this is it. Robert Michels' iron law of oligarchy is a theory from his 1911 book, Political Parties, stating that all organisations, regardless of their democratic intent, inevitably become ruled by a small, self-perpetuating elite, an oligarchy, due to the technical and practical needs of leadership and administration, making true democracy impossible in large-scale groups. Michel observed that even socialist parties aiming for equality developed hierarchical structures where leaders became detached from members, controlling information and resources to maintain power. A pattern, he argued, is a fundamental, unavoidable feature of organisation.
That's when you've got a sort of rational kind of minded person in charge. Would you like to hear Robert Reich's 4 axioms for dealing with Trump? So I think he was Clinton's. He was a secretary for
Treasury Secretary.
Treasury Secretary and Treasury for Labour. So axiom number 1. This is for interpreting Donald Trump. Whatever Trump asserts to be a fact is either a wild exaggeration or a bald-faced lie. Always disregard that. So that's number 1. Number 2. Whatever Trump blames on anyone else is something he's done. He's not, and that's what he's worrying about, that someone's going to discover that he's done it. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, whatever he criticises as being fake news is a fact he doesn't want you to know, so pay special attention to it. And then the 4th one, whenever he attacks some source of information, whether it's a survey or a poll or a report, it's come up with some truth that he fears. So look at that and share it. I just thought that was all brilliant, actually. It was really, really good.
We've got still another 3 years of this man to go.
Well, if he survives that long, he's not looking very healthy.
Perhaps we also need, in the political sphere in Scotland, some rupture.
Yeah.
End of conversation.
Hi, Pete.
And on that happy note.
Yeah, thank you both for coming along. As ever, that was fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Thanks very much to Bill and Isobel being in the studio. It wasn't quite the end of the conversation because this is a fast-moving situation, Arctic security. We recorded on a Tuesday. On the Wednesday, John Swinney made a very interesting speech. It was a very interesting international audience. The speech was at the University of Edinburgh, and we'll put the link to that speech in the notes for this because I do think it's worth listening to, and we will probably come back to that speech for a later podcast.
It was a really good chat with Bill and Isobel. As always, they're just always fascinating to kind of talk to.
We mentioned Mark Carney's speech a few times in that conversation, particularly the point about the rupture. So here's a clip of him explaining what he means by that.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited.
As you've been saying, there are other things happening almost at the same time. We need to go away and have a wee listen to them and see what we think. We might well be back with a follow-up, but we'll see what happens.
Okay.
But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching this one.
Thanks. Bye now. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.